Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's episode of Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. In this series, we hear from people from the field of eating disorders who share their professional and personal journeys, experiences, reflections, their big ideas that are never quite represented in this way in academic publications and professional conferences. I'm Kathy Pike, clinical psychologist and professor at Columbia University, and I am your host for Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. Delighted to be with you today and delighted to be joined by Professor Kyle DeYoung. Professor DeYoung is a psychologist on faculty in the Department of Psychology at University of Wyoming. He is also associate editor of Eating Behaviors and is a former president of the Academy for Eating Disorders. Kyle, it's really great to have you here.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure's mine.
So, Kyle, we'll start sort of at the beginning. Growing up years, when did you have an inkling that you were going to go into psychology, into mental health? How did that all start for you?
It caught me by surprise, I think, somewhere in the spring semester of my freshman year in college. I was at the University of Iowa, having grown up in South Holland, Illinois, is about 3 hours away, which felt quite far for me at the time. And that was among the few drivers for why I went there, but I ended up getting very lucky in a number of ways in my education. And this was one of them, that I went as an electrical engineering major for no particularly good reason. Aside from a high school guidance counselor who said, "Oh, you're good at math, you should do engineering." It was no more elaborate than that. And in any event, one of my roommates for my first 2 years, he had taken intro to psych, whatever it was called at the time, in our fall semester. And during registration for spring semester, he and I were just simply chatting about classes, and he'd mentioned that class is one he really enjoyed. I'd never taken a psychology class. I'm not sure I could have provided a accurate definition of the field even at that point in my life. But just the idea of a college class that someone could enjoy struck me as novel. I should tell you, I guess, how I was feeling about my coursework. And so I fitted into my schedule. I was still an engineering major, but took the liberty of squeezing an additional class in among all the other engineering things for that spring semester. And it was David Watson, who I think might be nearing his retirement now. I know he's at Notre Dame now, but he was at Iowa at the time, and he was teaching that intro to psych course that semester. Of course, I had no idea who he was apart from anyone else. But he was an engaging professor, immediately had my attention. Both his passion for the material, but also the material itself struck me as inherently interesting in a way that nothing else I was studying was interesting to me in any way similar. So that really got the hooks in me. But in terms of, an applied aspect of that discipline in clinical psychology specifically, that took quite a bit longer. And to kind of jump forward in the story, I eventually changed my major and dropped the engineering stuff. And basically, I took every psychology class I think that was offered available to me. I was really excited by it all. I added a philosophy degree, a separate degree in philosophy, a BA in philosophy as well, and some religious studies stuff. So you're getting the picture. I was really interested in, I think, understanding in people and what drives the things we do, our belief systems, and our thinking and so on. And but of those disciplines, psychology certainly was the one that had me most excited because it felt like the most tangible to me, the area that something could actually be done in. Toward getting into my senior year, I had worked in a couple of labs, as a research assistant. One in social psychology, one a little more in health psychology, but it was in the hospitals. And I was actually interacting with some patients in the hospital who had chronic, or in some cases also terminal conditions, and interviewing them about kind of coping broadly, but also some end of life kind of decisions and stuff like that, really out of my depth. But I felt quite compelled by that experience of being able to interact with people in such a important time of their lives and about such important, topics, I guess. And that distinguished it from the social psych lab I was in, which was methodologically cool. It was neat, right? We're tinkering with all kinds of little things and just seeing people in all these little minor ways to see how they would react. And I learned a lot of things there. But that distinction of sort of importance was one that was weighing heavily on me. So as I went into my senior year and started thinking about, what am I going to do with all of this education that I was accumulating? I thought about clinical psychology, and that my senior year then was Pam Keel's first year at the University of Iowa after she had left Harvard. And that's the second time in my life I got really fortunate from an educational and training perspective, because I think she was probably desperate and probably would have taken anybody with a heartbeat, which is why it was helpful for me, because I didn't really have any qualifications to offer except that I had a heartbeat and was willing and interested. So I really fell into eating disorders in that way. And for your listeners, I'm sure they all know who Pam Keel is and the influence she's had over the field and in training people. And but again, another time in my life where I really didn't know who, I couldn't tell you why she was important. Aside from she was a professor in the department, and there was a flyer saying she needed people in her lab. But again, she was infectious. Her passion for the subject and her interest in discovery, and also her rigor in the design of research and conduct of research just really captured me. So I ended up staying on with her 2 more years as a post-bac research assistant, managing one of her large grants. And, that's what ended up getting me into graduate
Really
school.
hooked you. You're in her lab. You're a project coordinator, spending a couple of years getting more experience, understanding more what clinical psych is, and specifically eating disorders. And you decide you're going to go to a clinical psych program. Where did you wind up going, and what was that next step like?
Oh, yeah. I ended up going to SUNY Albany, and my mentor there was Drew Anderson. Going from Pam to Drew, Pam's pretty hands-on and certainly in some very useful ways, and Drew is pretty hands-off, also in some pretty useful ways. But it was a really change in perspective for how I was to get on with my mentor. But Drew really he gives you space as a student to explore your ideas, to make mistakes too. That's something that's been true in my whole life, though. I'm the kind of person who, unfortunately, learns more from making my own mistakes than from others' mistakes. I wish that wasn't true of me, but I'm old enough now where I think I shouldn't expect that to change.
Might be true for most of us. Yeah.
It may be. It feels especially salient to me. But yeah, he let me explore, test some, in retrospect, probably not worthy of testing ideas, but in the process, I think it helped refine my own sense of what is a good idea and what are good ways of going about it. And he always, his feedback was always spot on, when it was requested, but he wasn't gonna be inserting himself between a student and their learning, essentially. He's very well read and very sharp person. So and widely read. I think is actually the better way of phrasing that. So if you get him talking about some subject, he'll throw out about 6 citations. You have to jot down really quickly. And I always was amazed by that. I think most students experience their mentor in that way. But still to this day, when I interact with him, and he'll do the same thing. And I'm like, really? I haven't caught up at all to your reading of the literature yet, because I don't know what you're talking about, and I need to go read on it. I had the fortune also of doing a summer research fellowship at Mass General Hospital during my graduate school training. So got to work a bit with the folks there in the eating disorder world at Mass General, which was very helpful for me in getting some more familiarity with some data collected in a clinical hospital setting. Their longitudinal data set is specifically what I worked with, and was helpful from in a number of ways. So your comment about mentors is making me think of that, because I oftentimes think about my own training as sort of, the chapters of mentorship and who I was able to work with. And that's certainly how it's organized in my mind.
Yeah. And so what particularly drew you to, beyond the mentors, which I do understand, but great mentors, I'm sure you have friends and colleagues who are great ideas people and mentors, but they're in a field that you just didn't opt to pursue. So what was it about eating disorders per se that caught your imagination?
I think that, again, referring back to how I really fell into Pam Keel's lab, it was, I think it was a matter of timing and serendipity, and that in all likelihood, there's probably half a dozen or more different topics she could have been studying had she been as infectious with her interests as she was, that I probably would have picked up on and used as an opportunity to, a springboard to get into graduate school the way that I did. And I probably would have been just as interested and happy with them, which makes it not a very interesting story, right? It'd be nice if I had, it's like, oh, well, eating disorders because of this formative experience and this thing that, makes them so important to me. So it doesn't have that element. What I will say is, I came to, I think, become quite attached to the topic and sympathetic and for the people who and families who experience them through my contact with those people. I remember quite distinctly the study I was managing for Pam Keel during my post-bac years had me meeting patients at the hospital for a clinical research appointment where they would get blood draws and do some other aspects of a protocol that were done in the hospital. But I was there to make sure, things went according to plan, and also be a sort of a warm face that the participant will have recognized from previous appointments and all those things. And it occurred, I think they had to be there at 7 a.m. or something like that. And a lot of these participants were college students. It was always a struggle to make sure folks were there on time. And it's hard for me too, if I'm being honest with you, at that point in my life, to get myself over to the hospital at 7 a.m. But these appointments stretched for a couple hours, at least a few hours, I think, in the hospital, if I'm remembering correctly. It gave me, there was a lot of downtime, and I'd chat with folks, and I learn about them. And certainly from the diagnostic interviews preceding those appointments, I learned a lot of sensitive and personal information from people. And I guess I very much feel for what they're going through in the best way that I could, having not experienced it myself. But I think you have enough of those experiences, whether they're research or in the clinical realm over time, where the familiarity of the subject just ends up occupying a pretty large space in your heart, I guess, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where I am now. It definitely isn't, where I started again. I feel like it could have been anything.
Yeah. Well, again, I think your candor, I often say, students sometimes ask me, how did you get to the position that you're in right now? And they're intrigued by doing mental health and global health work. And I always say it's a lot easier to tell in reverse, because I could not have predicted it going forward. And I think as you tell your story, it's a similar experience of certain moments in life trajectory that where lights go on and opportunities avail themselves, and you move forward and become more and more engaged. And it's quite compelling, actually, that's really how life can be. And so I wonder, as you're getting more and more interested in eating disorders, more and more entrenched in the field with the ideas and the, your mind and your heart, as you get to know these folks who are grappling with eating disorders, what were the particular aspects of eating disorders that you started to study, how did you engage clinically or from a research side specifically?
The focus of my attention in eating disorders really moved around a lot. I had many, I think I still have many interests And it also followed a bit of this opportunity kind of trajectory. With Pam Keel, that study that I was in charge of managing was investigating cholecystokinin, a gut hormone that seems to be related to feelings of fullness in women with purging disorder, and comparing them to women with bulimia nervosa who had previously been demonstrated to have a blunted cholecystokinin response to a test meal, and wondering whether women with purging disorder, of course, who will engage in purging after eating smaller amounts of food rather than these larger binge episodes like in bulimia nervosa, whether they might have perhaps exaggerated cholecystokinin responses, leading them to feel fuller after smaller amounts of food, or just not blunted responses, and whether this is a physiological marker of a difference between these diagnoses. And Pam Keel found support for that latter idea in that study. But I mentioned that to say that, being the first study I was kind of in charge of in the field, not my idea, of course, but it was very physiological. It had, I was doing a lot of reading. I don't know how great of a coordinator I was, but I spent a lot of time reading, and it was certainly useful to me in the long run. And I got familiar with a lot of things that I'd never encountered in my psychology courses, which were, primarily giving me some basic understanding, of course, in the different disciplines of psychology, and in the more advanced kind of clinical courses, of course, abnormal psychology and so on, covering diagnostics and treatment and so on, but really shying away from a lot of the biological aspects, which a lot of psych majors, I think, prefer to do. And I never really had much sense of how relevant it all was. So I spent a lot of time initially reading all that. There were other hormone type studies going on in Pam's lab at the time that similarly had me reading material about ovarian hormones in particular that I was entirely unfamiliar with. But going into graduate school, that was not the kind of work being conducted in Drew Anderson's lab. The program more broadly was firmly rooted in cognitive behavioral training, really, historically even more behavioral than anything else, and that became a major, I think, strength of mine over time, is being able to think through in ways really true to the theories, how to conceptualize problems from these behavioral and then later more cognitive behavioral perspectives that are and being constrained by the theory in important ways. But I got pretty far from any of that physiological, biological stuff. It kind of was put on pause. So my work during that time was really, I think in retrospect, trying to refine my own cognitive behavioral understanding of eating disorders using pretty dominant models at the time, and still dominant to this day. But then after that, I think I've noticed I've gone pretty heavily back into thinking about how behavior and physiology are really coupled, and how that coupling is probably pretty important to understand in the eating disorders, probably all disorders, but maybe especially eating disorders because of their nature. But still to this day, any student who works with me, I hope they would tell you that I try not to tell them what to do, as long as they want to do something that I could generally maybe claim some competence over in terms of being able to supervise them on. I'm okay with it, which means we have usually any number of very different things happening in the lab at any one time. But I like that. It keeps me excited and makes me read things I wouldn't otherwise read. It probably means my own program of research has gone more slowly than it otherwise would have gone, but I'm all right with that.
Well, there's a saying, right? If you want to go fast, go it alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it's usually a reference to bringing people along, but it may also be a reference to bringing ideas along. And so I wonder, Kyle, as I hear you say that, I'm thinking about the research that you've been leading and sort of some of the big ideas that are on your mind. I've asked you to focus on one big idea for this episode. What has this experience brought to that conceptualization for you? What's a big idea that really matters to you at the moment?
the big idea, I guess I'm hesitant to call it a big idea. It's the idea I've been working on here for a while, and maybe it'll end up being kind of important, maybe not. It is about how disruptions to our circadian rhythm, this 24-hour internal rhythm that is timed by external influences, how disruptions in that rhythm might be related to some of the eating disorder behaviors, and in particular binge eating and restrictive eating that we observe in folks with eating disorders. I've been focusing mostly on folks with non-low weight binge spectrum type eating disorders now, due to all the complications that occur with low weight, and really not being able to wrap my head around how all this might generalize to that group yet. But maybe it's relevant there too, I'm not sure. And the basic idea is that regular eating in people who wouldn't identify as having any problems with their eating, and maybe no one else would identify as such either. That kind of eating is partly regulated by circadian rhythms. We don't eat while we're sleeping, not just because we can't, but also, I mean, we wake up and we generally don't eat. There's of course problems that we've come to call a certain thing when folks do that. But generally, we don't do that, mostly because we're not hungry in the middle of the night. And there's these circadian regulated mechanisms that control our hunger while we sleep, so we don't wake up hungry. It's the longest we go without eating, of course, is overnight, and yet we don't wake up hungry. Our bodies are made to do this, and we've adapted exquisitely for living on this planet that makes a rotation every 24 hours. And with that said, it's not difficult, particularly in our modern environment, to have that circadian system disrupted.
Kyle, can you tell me, what was your experience, or what got you thinking that circadian rhythm was relevant to eating disorders?
Yeah, I didn't mention my internship training, and that's really where this starts. Actually, I was another time in my life extremely lucky to end up at the Western Psychiatric Institute, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, for my clinical internship, probably because I did the match thing with my wife, who was a much better applicant than I was, and they wanted her so bad, I think they accepted me along with her. That also exposed me to a couple different literatures I hadn't been familiar with before, and eventually to this rather small literature. It's still small to this date, but at the time was especially small, where light therapy had been tested in women with bulimia nervosa, and the effects were pretty consistent across these studies, with, I think, as I recall, kind of one exception, and fairly dramatic. The trials were brief, which was the piece that made them dramatic to me, anyway. Typically only a few weeks long, maybe 4 weeks or so, which of course in the context of a treatment for an eating disorder is an extremely short amount of time.
Right.
And these dramatic reductions in binge eating frequency.
Huh.
And I'd never heard of anybody talking about these studies. By the time I found them, they were over a decade old, I think. And then I went to look for newer stuff, and there just wasn't anything. It kind of looked like
a dead end.
Yeah, it just kind of rose up and then it kind of fell off. And they weren't bad studies. They were fairly small, of course, and sample size, and some had some design limitations, as early treatment studies oftentimes do. But they weren't bad studies, and they weren't in bad journals or anything like that either. It just seems like maybe they failed to garner wider interest or something. And I brought them up to some people I was working with at the time. This was when I got my first job after my training. I was in North Dakota, and I was getting to collaborate with some of the folks in Fargo there, what was at the time called the Neuropsychiatric Research Institute. And didn't get them too excited either. I think they'd probably agree with that characterization. And I was sort of left scratching my head a bit about like why folks wouldn't care about this, or what am I missing exactly. And so I really dragged my feet for a long time, trying to kind of hesitant about doing anything with it, but it kept coming back to me, probably because of that sleep training partly. But in thinking about like, why would light therapy, like how are lights related At the time, and still to this day, of course, emotion regulation theories were really starting to dominate. And so of course, my first thought was, well, maybe this is all mood driven. We know about the literature of light therapy and mood disorders. We know about the relevance of negative mood to binge eating. Maybe this is just a particularly, to me, interesting way of improving negative mood, and you're
Yeah.
reducing binge eating that way. But it looks like that's probably not the explanation. And we've since conducted our own light trial, and it's a very small one, found some positive results, and conducted a separate one similarly with positive results. And in tandem, the mood disorder literature has moved light years ahead, and they've concluded even that the mood effect is probably mediated by circadian regulation.
Interesting.
Yeah, so once that's really, this is one time I didn't need to do something for myself.
Mhm.
You know, looking at what the mood disorders folks were doing with light therapy and what they were learning about the mechanisms, I finally kind of dropped this idea that I need to explain some effect of light on binge eating through mood regulation, though that might be a relevant piece of it, but that there might be some more direct circadian regulation component. And light is known as a Zeitgeber in this literature. That means time giver, right? That it's our most potent external indicator of what time of day it is. So when you get bright light in the morning, it kind of synchronizes the circadian clock, but it's one of any number of Zeitgebers. The research in non-human animals typically focuses on three: light, physical activity, and eating. Eating is in the top three, and whether physical activity or eating is more important is, I think, a matter of legitimate debate. But they're in the top three in terms of these external sources of information that tell our brains what time of day it is, and therefore going forward the next day and the next day. When should I be prepared to do things such as wake up, be active? When should I be prepared to eat? And this, so you probably figured it out already. It's not a very complicated idea, but that's sort of my thinking of, well, when someone, has a binge eating episode in the evening, which is the diurnal rhythm of binge eating episodes, it serves as a pretty strong indicator to their circadian regulation aspect of their brains that, hey, this time of day is a time we eat a bunch of food. We should be prepared to do that tomorrow, for example. And so what's going to happen, partly, especially if this becomes a little more of a habit, is their body will be prepared for a large influx of calories late in the day, which is going to be associated with appetite and wanting to eat. And then similarly, of course, the diurnal pattern of restriction is to not eat earlier in the day. Probably partly, motivated by restraint and other sociocultural type influences, but also perhaps the diurnal pattern of our ability to inhibit our own behavior, right? We tend to be a little better earlier in the day. But that means, of course, that when you don't eat early in the day regularly, your body's going to essentially push back your meal timing. That's one way to kind of look at the general pattern of intake in folks with binge spectrum disorders, is that their intake of food is kind of shifted relative to their sleep-wake cycle compared to folks without those problems. And when society and their own motives might be telling them, I shouldn't eat anymore, it's 7 o'clock, I had dinner, I should be going to bed, their body might be getting them ready for another meal. And that combination of desires and societal pressures with their physiology, I think might really set someone up to do something that they then beat themselves up about. And so what's wrong with me? Why do I have such poor willpower and so on? Well, they might not have a whole lot of say in the matter.
Right. Really interesting. And what data do you have about the relationship between the binging and sleep patterns? Is that also part of this story, or are you able to look at the relationship between when people are binging and what the impact is on quality of sleep or duration of sleep? Does it matter?
That's not something that we focused on specifically in my lab, though I am familiar with some of the evidence in that area. Generally, we do see poor quality sleep with binge eating. And some folks have talked about there could be a direct effect of this, right? If you have a large binge episode just before you try to go to bed, you might be experiencing some discomfort, physical discomfort when trying to fall asleep. And that could directly interfere with sleep, push it back. So you have less sleep. You maybe still getting up at the same time in the morning, and now you have less sleep because you're falling asleep later, or maybe you're waking up even more frequently during the night because your body's trying to digest this large meal you had. Other hypotheses would include that a more indirect effect on sleep, which would occur through, again, the binge episode essentially serving as a late in the day zeitgeber. To the brain, it's external signals saying, hey, this time of day is not a time to get, to wind down and get ready for bed. It's a time of day to be ready to eat and digest, which would have, in theory, influences on subsequent nights in terms of making it more difficult to be ready to wind down when maybe you want to be winding down because your body's not quite there yet. It might be expecting some more food.
As you look at the circadian physiology, what does that mean exactly? For those of us who don't do that research, what do you actually measure, and how can you tell if things are, what's different for the person who's binge eating and the person who's not?
Yeah, circadian physiology. So there's a lot of things our bodies do on this 24-hour rhythm. Mm-hmm. And we've really focused so far on one because it's easy. It might also turn out to be a kind of lucky decision in a couple of ways, and that's cortisol, because you can measure it quite well through saliva. Mm-hmm. And cortisol is a very clear circadian rhythm. That again is easy to quantify too once you have the data from how much cortisol is in the saliva, and that's through what's known as the cortisol awakening response. So cortisol surges prior to awakening, and reaches its highest level within a half an hour after we wake up for the day, and then falls pretty dramatically in about the next half hour or so, reaching pre-waking levels within that first hour of waking. And then it kind of slowly drops off the rest of the day, reaching its lowest level in the middle of the night before it surges again in anticipation of waking. So cortisol, this HPA axis hormone, is really, we think of it as stress hormone, but of course its normal rhythm is to surge before waking. It's really largely responsible for readying us for activity in the day. Mm-hmm. Helps our brains make the transition from sleep to wake. Mm-hmm. And but if we think about that, what it's doing, right? It's surging before we wake up. Well, how the heck does it know what time you put on your alarm clock?
Yeah.
And it doesn't, of course. It's based on your habitual wake time. So if you wake at the same time every day, your surge is going to be very well timed to help you get up and out of bed and transition from sleep to wake in a way that's adaptive and helpful, right? Get the fogginess shaken from your brain, and also probably get ready to eat a meal right away and pretty soon after waking, and so on. Now, what happens if you don't have regular wake times, or you get up at a very different time without warning your brain you're going to do it, which of course we can't do. You either don't have that surge or you're going to miss it. And the way I sort of provide an analogy for what this feels like is if you are someone who wakes up regularly at about the same time, you probably have this very nice spike in cortisol, this awakening response that we can measure through saliva timed in the first hour after waking, a few saliva samples. Then it probably feels like when you have to get up like 4 hours early for a super early flight, where you just feel terrible. You're typically not hungry. If you do eat, you feel nauseated, or you don't eat a lot, that's for sure. And your head's just not quite right. Well, that's probably what folks who have a disrupted circadian rhythm are feeling like every day, because they're not experiencing this cortisol surge. And so what does that surge look like if you're not having it? It's basically blunted. But it's not just that the surge itself is lower, it's that decline over the rest of the day ends up being less. So the surge in the morning is lower, but also cortisol in the evening is higher. Because we can think of it like a wave, it gets flattened, exactly. So the bottom gets brought up and the top gets brought down. So we could both think about, well, what does it mean to have them less cortisol in the morning for things like appetite? But what also does it mean to have more cortisol in the evening for appetite. And this becomes potentially useful. But other ways of measuring it are with things like dim light melatonin onset. That's probably a slightly better way, but it requires an intravenous catheter and regular blood draws for usually a minimum 6 hours with a planned bedtime. And you have to do the whole thing under dark conditions. So much more labor intensive.
Yeah, and would create significant hurdles in terms of generalizability or other environmental factors that might be at play. So are you suggesting that for people who are binge eating, particularly those who are prone to binge eating late in the day, which is the more typical pattern, right, that they are experiencing elevated levels of cortisol, that because they haven't gone through this cycle in the same pattern where you'd expect a significantly lowered level by the time you're going to bed? Is that correct?
We think this is maybe something that's happening for some folks with binge eating. We have no, first of all, we don't know how many, what proportion, but secondly, we in no way think that everyone with binge eating is characterized by circadian disruption. I think binge eating is multiply determined. I don't think this theory in any ways undermines or even questions existing theory. I think it really exists at a separate level of analysis. It may be an and kind of situation, not an or. So I do think there are some people, and how many and what percentage is to be determined, I guess, who we could understand as having maybe a stronger circadian disruption drive to their binge eating. Other folks, social factors, emotional factors may be much more relevant. And again,
you can't really separate them, because maybe you can't really separate them, right? Because the behavioral aspects of routine, and like you were describing earlier, going to bed at a regular time, waking up at a regular time, that can be a executive order decision at some point, but becomes a biologically reinforced decision, which becomes an executive decision, like where's the chicken and egg, right? Yes. Dilemma about where we start the analysis. But clearly there are, as you said, levels or layers of systems that are part of this story. And the idea that the circadian cycle is significant here is one that's really intriguing at so many levels. And, when you said you're at Western Psychiatric, I thought you might go on to say that you met Ellen Frank and the work that she's done in terms of circadian cycles and mood disorders.
Yes.
And how dramatic the results are in terms of treating mood disorders with certain interventions around sleep and regulating circadian cycles in meaningful ways. So really fascinating, Kyle. You hesitated at the beginning to say, I don't know if it's a big idea, but I think this is really a fascinating whole program of research, and as a field, so important in terms of looking at eating behaviors from a different lens and bringing in, as you said earlier, the different layers or different systems of understanding, because the complexity of these conditions, it's great. The complexity is great, and we need to be thinking about the many different ways in which the dysregulation, the disruptions can occur and then be reinforced and ultimately reset or corrected. So really, really fascinating. Any last thoughts about this whole model and where you're going with it?
I hope other people join in and testing it, I guess would be my last thought. I fear that I always fear I have a blind spot and I'm not seeing something that someone else is going to see, some fatal flaw or even some way just to make more use of it. Because I ultimately hope it's useful, even though I'm sure it's wrong. I'm sure it's wrong in probably meaningful ways. But what I hope it is useful, right? In prompting not just us, but other people to do research we might not otherwise do that has some impact down the road. And improving treatment outcomes, I think is the most relevant potential outcome to this line. So yeah, I hope it's interesting enough to someone else out there that they'll join in and improve upon it or decide what direction is the best to take it from here.
Well, that's the voice, the mindset of a true scientist, right? You know that there are things that you don't know. There are things about this model that will be proven wrong eventually, but with the methodology and always looking for what you don't know, clearly you're helping us figure out more about these conditions, and it's a real contribution to the field. And thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your big idea.
Oh, well, thank you. It was really my pleasure.